bread fundamentally has three ingredients: flour. Usually we use wheat in our culture. Water. And yeast. And yeast can either be you can either culture wild yeast, which is a sourdough, or you can use yeast that's been cultured in factories, and it comes in different forms and qualities. This is a dry instant yeast, which is my preference if I'm going to use manufactured yeast. And tonight we're going to be just making a pre-ferment, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. So I'm only going to use a very small amount. So what I'm going to be doing is, because I'm going to be using this manufactured yeast, the instant yeast does not have the same kind of flavor as a cultured yeast. So we're going to give it some time to develop on its own. I'm going to take a small amount of flour compared to what I'm going to use when I actually bake it. I'm going to add a small amount of yeast and an even smaller amount of salt. You don't use a lot of salt overall in bread anyways, and because I want this to ferment as much as possible overnight, I don't want to add too much salt and slow that down. And then I'm going to add water. Now, what I'm looking for this is it to come together into a relatively stiff dough. And by that, I mean I don't want it to be sticking to my fingers in the way I am now, the way it is now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of flour at a time. And by the way, I'm going to be adding some whole wheat flour later in the process. But I'm also going to be using white flour, and white flour is a little simpler to bake bread with because of the lack of bran and the generally a little bit higher gluten content. I'm also going to use some high gluten flour called bread flour. See, this is starting to come together into a little bit of dough, and I'm not going to work it too much right now. Really, I just want it to come together enough that fermentation can happen. This is going to give a chance for the culture to develop in its own way a little bit and not be as bland, frankly, as it would be if I didn't do this. Yeah, it's starting. I think that looks about right. It's only a little bit, but it's going to be the starter for larger loaves, and we'll add more yeast later on as well. I'm actually going to try using a little bit of this dough at the end as sort of a Kickstarter for my own sourdough culture. And it won't really be any different than if I cultured it here just out of the wild yeast on its own, because what research has shown is that what happens over time is that your local yeast is going to take over your culture essentially no matter what. So, you know, sometimes people will bring sourdough cultures from other places, hoping that they will get bread that tastes the same, and you might for a little while, but then it's going to take on the characteristics of where you live because your local yeast, your indigenous yeast, is so well established there. So I'm going to cover this with a damp cloth to prevent it from drying out, and we'll take another look at it in the morning. One quick thing about ingredients. If you're going to use things like white flour and manufactured yeast, you want to choose ones that are high quality. You'll find that the price difference is small, but the quality difference is large. And also in terms of salt, it's best to use kosher salt or whatever salt that does not have any additives to it. All right, good morning. It's the next day. Let's see how we did. You can see that it's already rising. I see some bubbles. It's expanded. There's a lot of air inside, so it's fermenting. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make the dough and prepare it for the autolyse, where we're going to just not really knead it. We're just going to bring it together. So I'm going to add a lot of flour, more yeast, more salt, water, now again, I'm looking for that just right amount of stickiness and stiffness to the dough. And before we really do a lot of kneading, we'll do the autolyse, where it just, we're going to leave it alone. It's going to ferment. It'll start to develop the gluten on its own. It'll give a chance for the water to really be absorbed into the flour. And it'll be easier to work with afterwards. Give a generally better result. Now, one thing to keep thinking about is the slower your bread is ready, basically, the better its flavor it's going to be. So you want bread that takes a long time to make. I didn't add much. Add a little more salt, actually. That slows things down, too. I didn't add much yeast, again, a little bit. But I really want time for that yeast culture to develop. I think I got it on the first try this time. I've got pretty good texture. It's a little moist, but that's okay. It'll take a little while for all of the flour to absorb the water. So we'll come back and check in a little bit, and then we'll knead. All right, it's had a nice long autolyse. We can start to see some gluten formation. And now we're going to knead the dough. So we need to flour our work surface. And kneading is all about stretching and bringing the dough together into a stronger piece. You want to try to avoid getting too much of the flour inside the dough, but you do need a work surface where it's not going to just stick to everything. Now how I do this is stretch, fold, rotate, push. Stretch, fold, rotate, push, and just continue. It's really coming together quite easily because of the autolyse. Really see what the gluten is doing here. The gluten is what gives bread its stretch and its lift. Look at that. Look how much it can. This is good. I can start to feel the moisture coming back after having some of that flour coat the surface. I'm feeling pretty good about this, actually, even though that was a fairly quick knead. When I press, it leaves an indent. It takes a while to rebound. That's a good sign. We're going to return it to the bowl. Cover it again with my damp towel, and we're going to give it some time to rise. So the bread has been hanging out by itself for a while, so we're going to pull it out and fold it. I'm going to sprinkle flour on the work surface again. fold the bread, it's going to strengthen the dough. I'm going to stretch. Yeah, it's right there. And then you can help with another part, but not right now. Okay, and that's how you do that. So the dough's actually been kind of sitting around all day. So I'm a little worried it's going to be too slack. The best cure for that, though, is another fold. Just push down any air gently. I'll do like that. Okay. But I'm going to go ahead and turn the oven on at this point. I want a very hot oven. So I'm going to put it on at 450 degrees to start. And I need to make a decision about a cooking surface, whether I'm going to use a cast iron pan to bake it in, or the baking stone that I keep in there. Okay, well, the dough has risen. The oven is hot. We're going to shape the dough and let it rest for a few minutes. And then we'll put it in the oven. I decided we're probably going to use a cast iron Dutch oven. So what we're going to do is make a round loaf. And what I'm doing is as I pull, I'm tucking some of the dough underneath like this. And that's going to tighten the outside of the loaf. And it's being problematic, though. Look at that. It's not going to work. Yeah, I think the dough is a little slack and over-risen. But it'll still taste good. It just might not shape or rise as well, like this is refusing to do. It's going to have to be like this. So I'm going to just let this rest for a few minutes, then we'll score it and put it in the oven. All right, so the final two steps are going to be scoring the loaf and baking. This loaf is looking a little slack. It's not quite risen the way I would want it to. But that's what you get for leaving your dough sitting around all day, which I definitely did. So, we'll see how it is. I think it'll still taste good, and maybe we'll end up with a beautiful loaf beside all of that. So these next two steps need to be done with an adult because we are dealing with the sharp and the hot. Scoring the bread, you're going to need a sharp knife. Doesn't have to be as big as this one. This one's actually a little awkwardly large. But then you're going to do 2 or 4, depending on kind of what you want it to look like. I guess there could be any number of options. Slashes to open up the top. And the main thing is you need to be quick and bold because otherwise you'll just sort of tear at the loaf. All right. Next we'll be moving to the oven. And again, moving to the oven, we're going to be dealing with the very hot. So this is adult supervision required kind of activity. Okay, the oven's at a balmy 450 degrees. I've put a cast iron Dutch oven in there to get very hot. You also see my baking stone on the bottom. I've decided to use the Dutch oven for this because one of the things that's difficult about baking bread at home is that in a professional kitchen, shouldn't let all the heat out of the oven, the oven has vents where you can open or close to let the moisture that's coming out of the bread either stay in the oven or be released. Our home ovens can't do that. Whatever amount of moisture is in the bread is going to come out. So there's different strategies for solving that problem because you don't want the moisture to escape from the environment, at least not right away. So when I put on the lid, I'll trap all of the moisture inside the Dutch oven, and hopefully that will give us a nice crust to our loaf. So let's give this a go. I would put it in a baker's peel if I was putting it on the stone, but I'm going to just put it right in here, like that. And put the lid on, push it back in. And I think I'm going to leave it like that for about half an hour and come check on it. Yep. So it seems that my timer technology failed me. The device I thought was running a timer didn't. So I started smelling bread and wondered how much time was left, so I checked, and that's when I discovered the reality. So I have no idea how long the bread has been in the oven, but I did just open it up and take a look, and I'll show you in a moment. But the other thing that I did was I took the temperature of the bread with an instant read thermometer. A fully cooked bread will be about 200 degrees, and right now it's about 185. I took the top off. I'm going to leave it off so that the crust continues to brown. Watch it. All right. But it's really looking pretty good. I'd show you taking the temperature, but it's really better to keep it in the oven so it stays as hot as possible. All right, we're gonna check the bread. I have the instant read thermometer ready. So the crust is looking darker. Hopefully you'll be able to see some of this. .206. The crust is very crusty. Pull it out. So what I've done is very carefully taken the bread out of the Dutch oven and put it onto a cooling rack. It's very tempting to crack into fresh bread, but you really want to let it cool completely, because all the gas in there is expanded, and it's going to take until it cools for that gas to condense and for the size of the air pocket to get smaller. So we're going to probably have to give this at least 3 hours or so before we cut into it. But that's good. That gives us time to make the rest of our dinner.